have you ever looked at a situation and noticed something that everyone else seemed to miss? Maybe you noticed that a friend wasn't really okay, even though they kept saying they were fine. Maybe you noticed that someone suddenly started acting differently. Or maybe you walked into a room and immediately felt that something was off, even though you couldn't explain exactly why. And then someone says, "What are you talking about? Everything seems normal." That's when you start wondering, how did I notice that? Here's the interesting part. People who notice things others aren't always the smartest people in the room. They don't necessarily have some special ability. They often just do something very simple. They pay attention. Most of us move through the day at full speed. We look at our phones. We answer messages. We think about what we're going to do next. We're listening to someone while secretly thinking about something completely different. So we see things, but we don't always really notice them. And that's where the difference begins. Think about the last time someone you knew was having a bad day. Maybe they didn't tell you. Maybe they even said, "I'm fine." But something was different. Their voice was quieter. They weren't laughing as much. They answered your questions a little faster. Maybe they looked away when you asked how they were doing. None of those things, by themselves, means much. But when you put them together, you start seeing a different picture. That's something people who notice more tend to do. They don't just look at what's happening, they notice what has changed. And sometimes, the smallest change tells you more than the biggest event. There's another thing they tend to do. They don't always accept the first explanation. Someone says, "That's just how he is." And most people move on. But another person might think, "Has he always been like that?" Someone says, "She's just tired." They might think, "Maybe. But why has she been acting this way for the last few weeks?" Someone says, "Everyone does that." They might quietly wonder, does everyone really? It's not about trying to disagree with everyone. It's about being curious. Instead of immediately saying, "I know what this is," they sometimes ask, what if there's more to it? And that one question can completely change what you notice. Imagine you're walking down a street you've walked down hundreds of times. You've seen the same buildings, the same stores, the same trees, the same road. You probably think you know the place, but then one day, you notice a tiny sign you've never seen before. You wonder, was that always there? Probably. You just weren't looking for it. That's how life works too. Sometimes the information isn't new. Your attention is. You can be around the same person for years and suddenly notice something about them you've never noticed before. You can do the same job for months and suddenly realize there's a pattern in the way things happen. You can repeat the same mistake over and over and then one day finally see what caused it. The world didn't suddenly change. You finally slowed down enough to see it. And there's something even more interesting. People who notice a lot often connect little things together. Imagine someone keeps saying they're tired. That doesn't seem unusual. Everyone gets tired. But then you notice they stopped going outside. They stopped talking to their friends. They stopped doing things they used to enjoy. They've been staying home more. And suddenly those separate little details don't feel so separate anymore. You start thinking, maybe something is going on. That's another difference. Some people see 5 separate things. Other people see how those 5 things might be connected. And you don't need to be a genius to do that. You just need to stop treating every detail like it's completely unrelated. But there's a catch. Seeing things others doesn't mean you're always right. This is important because sometimes your brain can connect things that aren't actually connected. You notice someone doesn't reply to your message. Then you start thinking they're angry. You notice someone looks at you differently. You start wondering if you did something wrong. You notice 2 things happening at the same time, and suddenly you've created an entire story in your head. But the story might not be true. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they didn't even notice you. So noticing more doesn't mean assuming more. In fact, it's almost the opposite. You notice something, and then you stay curious. You don't immediately turn a clue into a conclusion. You give yourself time to find out what's actually happening. And this leads to one of the most important traits of people who notice deeply. They're often comfortable saying, "I don't know yet." Think about how rare that is. Most people want an answer immediately. Who was wrong? What happened? Why did they do that? What's going to happen next? We want everything explained. But sometimes, the smartest response is simply, "I don't know." Maybe you need more information. Maybe you need to wait. Maybe there's something you haven't seen yet. And that's okay. Because when you stop rushing toward an answer, you give yourself a chance to notice something you would have missed. But here's where this gets personal. Because the person you may be worst at observing is yourself. You might notice when your friend is changing. You might notice when someone else is making the same mistake. You might notice when another person is avoiding something. But can you notice your own patterns? Maybe every time you're stressed, you disappear from people. Maybe whenever something gets difficult, you suddenly find something else to do. Maybe you keep saying you want something, but your actions keep moving in the opposite direction. And sometimes the hardest thing isn't seeing what's happening. It's admitting what you're seeing. Because it's easy to observe someone else. It's much harder to look at yourself and say, "Maybe I'm doing this too." There's also a downside to noticing everything. If you constantly look for hidden meanings, you can start seeing problems that aren't really there. You can overthink a simple conversation. You can replay someone's words 10 times. You can turn a small change into a huge story. So the goal isn't to become suspicious of everything. The goal is to become more aware without becoming trapped in your own thoughts. Notice, question, think, but don't assume. That's the balance. And maybe that's what makes these people seem different. They don't necessarily see a completely different world. They're just willing to look at the same world for a little longer. While everyone else is rushing to the next thing, they pause. While everyone else accepts the obvious answer, they ask one more question. While everyone else sees an isolated moment, they notice the pattern. And while everyone else is looking outward, sometimes they turn that attention back toward themselves. That's where real insight begins. So try something simple today. The next time you're talking to someone, don't just listen to their words. Notice their tone. Notice their energy. Notice what's different. The next time something keeps going wrong, don't just ask, "Why did this happen?" Ask, "Has this happened before?" And the next time you catch yourself reacting in a familiar way, stop for a second and ask, "Why do I always do this?" You might discover something you didn't know about yourself. And that's the strange thing about seeing what others don't. Sometimes you're not discovering something hidden in the world. You're simply paying enough attention to notice what was there all along. Because sometimes the world isn't hiding anything from you. You're just looking at it too quickly.